everyone to our CACE 2022 panel, Remembering Bell Hooks at CACE, a reflection on spacemaking at UNC Greensboro. My name is Noelle Morrissette. I am the Program Director of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at UNCG. And I'm joined by my colleague who will introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Armondo Collins, head of the Digital Media Commons and an adjunct professor in AADS.
Yes. So we're here. Most of you will know something of Bell Hooks, and she was a dynamic person, so there's lots to reflect on. But just, out of the biography of Bell Hooks's life, remembering the fact that she is a Black Southern woman, that she is born and raised in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, and that her trajectory is taking her to major research institutions across the United States. So starting with Stanford, right? Then moving on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then moving on to UC Santa Cruz, right?
Not the most diverse spaces in the world.
Not at all the most diverse spaces in the world, and elitist as well, right?
Yes.
So there's this real kind of space making that she's doing as she's moving through here. The other thing I would emphasize is that as she's moving through her trajectory, and that her training, her background is in English as well as ethnic studies, that she's moving through more universities as an instructor. So starting at USC, University of Southern California, then UC Santa Cruz, then San Francisco State University, then Yale, then Oberlin, then City University of New York, and finally returning home and away to Berea College in Kentucky. So, just in terms of spatial and academic movements and bell hooks in places, those are important things to remember. Do you want to add anything on that, Armondo?
Well, I mean, of all of the places and spaces that she traveled, one of the most important and dear to me is she came here. And in fact, she came at a very pivotal moment in UNCG history. We had integrated, however, and we had become a co-ed campus. However, there was effectively no Black student life. If you go through the oral histories of African Americans at UNCG, over and over again, a theme from students recounting their time here is that they went to class here, but their social life was at A&T. Well, around the time Bell comes, she comes at the behest of students who are trying to organize a Black student union, what we know as the Neo-Black Society now. Was an outgrowth of Bell Hooks coming. Students organized to bring her here and organized the Neo-Black Society upon their hearing Bell Hooks. There isn't a direct correlation, but this is all happening at the same time and is a well-documented event in UNCG history.
Yeah.
And when thinking about place and space, for me, I've been talking about like centering yourself, putting yourself in place. Very often, the alienation that African Americans describe is because in society, ourself, especially in public spaces, has to be almost removed. It's that double consciousness that Du Bois talks about famously. Well, Bell Hooks was, in my opinion, a person who embodied recentering the self. And her project was just that. The conversation that she was having when she was here was on that trajectory of decolonizing the institution as a part of a racist, sexist, patriarchal system. So part of that project was a conversation about centering the self, putting yourself back in place in order to negotiate yourself through the physical space. These conversations are happening at a time when African Americans, if you can talk about ethos writ large, like it's this worldview or this big thing, you can say we're having the conversation publicly, we belong to us. And to further extend it, I belong to me. We're coming out of the mid-20th century where Americanism is shaped by this nationalized ethos. As racist as it is, there is this group think that must kind of be unpacked. And if you read Bell Hooks over and over again, she is a master at it. And she's helped us create the language of unpacking it in very real ways. But it comes from what I think is that space of understanding that what we're experiencing in the temporal has its own history and a trajectory that is often misaligned with the best interest of us as individuals and maybe certain groups within the structure.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me, you know, that we can think of one of her major concepts, the oppositional gaze, as an ethos, right? You know, that there's a way in which the work that she's doing in a book like Black Looks, some of the other works that are emerging in the 1990s, is to offer a framework for restructuring, a framework for self-assertion, right? But also something that is revealing the confines that have been imposed, right? So, yeah, those very statements that she's making about, you know, the way in which knowledge is structured and, you know, the expected roles of race and sex as they apply to Black women, Black men, right?
And interrogating it not only like interracial struggle, but intraracial struggle. Interrogating some of the patriarchy that is inherent in assumptive Black thought. And understanding it as not only a negative outgrowth, but something that has to be overcome if we are going to get to a liberatory space. Again, that at the time she's creating that language, she's writing from a very long tradition of writers. However, the space that she's in right now, that isn't mainstream, that isn't what's marketable. She becomes, especially as, like you say, a Black woman from the South, a very key and pivotal figure in that transition from Black power to, I guess, the more contemporary forms of social justice. There is almost, the 80s wound up being like this liminal space where African Americans are coming out of open rebellion and protest to this space. The country decides if we can read it writ large. Two ways of handling this: lock them up or give them jobs. Integrate them in a very passive, conformist way, or take everybody who doesn't fit in and frame them in such a way that they stand outside of society and have a mechanism of dealing with that. And that's for a person standing on the public stage at this time, a Black person, you have to remember that, okay, they just killed Martin and Malcolm for being too frank. As much as we talk about the First Amendment, Black speech is always not free. there's always the threat of death.
Right.
I mean, up until the threat of death, not just losing your job. I'm telling somebody, white or black, may kill you for going what is perceived as too far. But Bell Hooks lived in the too far. Well,
She did. She
like
did.
when we're talking about place and space, she was never, okay, well, it's all said, it's okay.
Right. Yeah. And there's trouble that accompanies that, right?
Good trouble though, good trouble.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting thinking about her career over the decades, right? We're talking about somebody who's coming into academia in the mid 70s, right? Like just going with what you've just traced out, mid 70s, all the way through to the 2000s, right? 2010s, and in her active places, and thinking about the way that her individual evolutions are kind of accompanied by transformations in terms of Black studies becoming, in some places, ethnic studies, and other places becoming African and African American and African diasporic studies, that essentially her career is something that helps us think about the way that her work has helped to shape the discourses within these different realms: feminist studies, ethnic studies, sexuality studies, African American studies. And also, so it's her distinct contribution, but also, just the context, the resources, the ways that those discourses have changed and been challenged over those decades, right? That a Black studies program of the 1970s is not going to look like a Black studies program of the 2000s, right?
Yeah. Well, and neither is going to look like, more than likely, an ethnic studies program, although they, from an institutional perspective, all of that is the same thing or interchangeable. But one thing I loved about Bell, again, talking about her in place, is her interrogation of semiotics. Like, language means everything, and not just it's not an empty wordplay. It is a tool and function of power and control. That's why Bell decapitalized her name. Like, I got to see my entire first semester in African American literature because I kept putting capitalizations on Bell Hooks. My teacher was like, "You don't know what you're talking about." I'm like, "What do you mean?" But I mean, that was actually an act of rebellion, but indicative of Bell's understanding of language and power.
Yeah.
And how it plays into power dynamics. One privilege of racism for whites has been the ability to define reality, name and define reality.
Yeah.
And that is a very real control of the discourse. And what has happened over Bell, her career, to your point, shows that when racism is challenged, confronted, and readjusted, it simply readjusts itself to maintain power. Oh, we'll give you Black studies, but we're going to call it ethnic studies, and it's going to get framed this way. And you better have a certain number of majors and minors, or we're going to cut your funding. Like, you've won the thing, but now you're in the grips of the thing.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very, very true. Well, so thinking about this, Bell Hooks came and gave a talk at UNC Greensboro in 1989. So just prior to the formation of what would be our program.
Program, yeah.
Right? So at that point, we had courses. At that point, there's work being done in religious studies to come up with a conference that addresses African American experiences and cultures, right? At that point, CACE is just Conference on African American Experiences, Cultures and Experiences. There's no African diasporic, right?
So she came in 89.
She came in 89, but no, she came a second time, right? So
Oh,
in 89, it was just as CACE was being put together as a conference. It came out
okay.
of religious studies because there was no program officially, right, in
Yeah.
AAPS. And then, so I like to think, I don't know what the content of that particular lecture was, but I like to think that in a sense, bringing up someone who was really presenting herself as a public academic front and center on UNC Greensboro's campus was part of the impetus that led to our CACE program, right? And then Bell Hooks came back in the year 2000 to give her talk, right? So that's the one. Let's see, I have the, do you have the title handy? I know I have it, if you don't.
No, I don't.
Let's see. I have it here. There's CACE 2000, I want to say. Yeah, so CACE 2000, Undoing Racism in the Curriculum and Community. Right? So CACE 2000 is 2 years before we end up with our official major in African American studies, right? And so in a sense, I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is we've got speakers moving through our campus, as well as our scholars and intellectuals, a small number of them, who are here and trying to build something, right? So in a sense, Bell Hooks becomes part of that, right?
Yes, very much so. I was I had my timeline 10 years off. So if we're at 89, you're right. The school is a lot more integrated. But this is right before I went to college. And when I came here, UNCG was not considered the minority serving institution that it is right now.
Right.
To put it kindly, it was very conservative still.
Yeah.
Talking about place and space, it was designed to be the polar opposite of space, vis-a-vis A&T. There were a fair number of Black students, but it was not the 40% that we have right now.
No.
Not even half of that. And to be an African American on campus at that time, I would think there was a lot of more fitting in than standing out.
Absolutely.
As a mode of survival. And what she is talking about, I would believe at that first forum with that title is what she was talking about in Teaching to Transgress, like what I was saying. The quote, she said that her goal was to interrogate biases in curricula that reinscribe systems of domination, like racism and sexism, while at the same time providing new ways to teach diverse groups of students. She's not just doing this thinking about Black students, but as a student population, she's thinking of the diversity of everybody.
Yeah.
How do you teach from a space of fairness in this pluralized America? It's always been plural, but we've never really discussed it. In fact, we've framed it as this binary society, right, of good and evil, light and dark, Black and white. How do we how do we get over that structuring and create something that is more just and equitable and realistic in reference to the people that we're talking to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, and thinking about when she's giving the talk, it's sort of the 2000 talk. So, I mean, it's off of the heels of a decade of multiculturalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's that the 90s are a decade in which you have people saying, I'm going to teach this book and I am not going to mention race at all because that's how it should be, right? I had a student once who told me that her teacher taught her Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man without referencing race. And I thought,
Then what was it about?
do that, right? I mean, that's the wrong kind of invisibility,
Yeah.
right? So if I think of Bell Hooks and her concept of the oppositional gaze, or even an essay like Eating the Other, where she's talking about cultural, the fine line between cultural appreciation and appropriation,
Yeah.
right? It seems to me that she's trying to come up with a framework that is not a multiculturalism that is distinct boundary defined spaces for each group, right? But that when she talks about her desire for a diverse group of students who are going to learn about these things, that she is trying to transgress those boundaries, right?
Well, yes, because her, in my opinion, her idea of plurality isn't all of the boxes in the same space.
Mm-hmm.
It's an understanding of that the boxes they are in the same space, but they are not boxes. At the very least, it's like this weird interconnected Venn diagram of people. Like there's the categories of race, for instance, they don't completely box any human being in. It's not where you start and stop.
Right.
And in fact, understanding yourself in the world in such a way that is your start and stop, like if those boundaries still hold, how can you connect with somebody who's not in your box?
Right.
But we do it all the time, so the boxes really don't mean as much as we say they do mean.
Right. Right. Or have been determined to mean by right, and imposed.
And I can't get away from the idea of thinking what it's like to be her moving through that space with that mentality in a world that nobody is talking about it like this.
Right.
Not in such clear terms, especially in education being kind of the root of us all. We're all going through K through 12. We're all going through colleges, and we're not interrogating the epistemology of what we're being taught. Like, oh, it's not natural. Although we've naturalized it, those thoughts aren't naturalized. They have a root and in certain times, like an insidious trajectory. What Bell taught me was to look at everything from an RCA dog perspective, where you got to kind of twist your head to see it correctly. Like, is that what I'm hearing? Really? What she called it was it a pedagogy of suspicion?
Yeah.
At any rate, the point that I was trying to think of that I got from her was that she did ask us to interrogate our spaces to understand how much we're involved in making that as a reality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, I love her curiosity, and I feel the discomfort of things she said or did that were not maybe, you know,
Well,
the things that make her human, I guess is what I would say, right? I mean, who would go, well, all right, let me take that back. So in 1996, she published an essay about, all right, I had an affair with one of my graduate students. Here's how I think it could best be done. I know it's difficult, right? That's 1996. There's no way in the world that that would be permitted now. But if anyone was going to write that in 1996, it would have been a white man, right? So, and I'm not condoning any of that. I just think it's really interesting to think about the moments where Bell Hooks is a complex human being who is working through things instead of saying everything clearly and correctly, right?
At the forefront of her writing is her humanity.
Yeah.
And we tend to think of her as an academic, but at the same time, what I've always found engaging about her writing is her use of personal narrative to describe ideas that are usually part and parcel of academic discourses. Her writing is accessible to non-academics, and one of the writing strategies that she uses to make it so is personal narrative, the I. But that I, it's not just a writing trick. It is designed to center the reader in the narrative. I automatically creates a reflexive relationship with the text. The text is the I, and you're the I, and you're walking in the I. And to Bell's themes, or constant theme of trying to get people to see themselves in what they perceive as the other.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, that's a reverberating theme that goes throughout her writing. And I think it's a salient part of her. Like, she intentionally wanted to be that person that you always knew was a human being, a complex individual who has twists and turns, who wasn't on a pedestal or beneath the pedestal.
Yeah.
He didn't want to be, if that makes sense.
It sure does. I mean, and I think that that's right. So the personal narrative is, it's a space claiming practice, right? And it's a way of undoing the narratives that would reduce what it was that she'd be able to say or how she'd be able to participate in them, right? So if you think about her moving through a space like Oberlin or Yale, two examples I'm familiar with, right? That personal narrative takes on tremendous power, tremendous meaning, right? So I think that's extraordinary. And the other thing I think of is that she's emerging along with, Cornell West, Angela Davis, right, in the academic world of Black studies, African American studies, and advancing this idea of the public intellectual, right? And also advancing an idea of making scholarship accessible, right, to everyday readers, everyday folks. So as much as they can turn around and, talk about American pragmatism, say, Cornel West. He can also turn the other way and talk about things in a more familiar style. And it's the same knowledge, just a different delivery, right?
Those are two good examples. And that underscores everything that I was just talking about with Bell. Cornell is, especially like when race matters. Sounds like he just got out of, came from his dissertation. It's very dense, thick. Like you need a dictionary to read it.
Yeah.
And I mean, no matter who you are, right now, go through it. It's not made, clearly it wasn't made for 19-year-old Armondo. Just, it was, but it wasn't. But Bell Hooks, it was and it was. I understand it exactly what you were saying at that time, the whole way through. And she does that intentionally to bring people up. She wants the biggest tent possible. I want all of you guys in here. You don't have to be from my narrow discipline or from my perspective or from my presumed group to understand how this impacts you. She's right around the same time as I think Chwanza Kunjufu. And that comparison is very similar to West, although he is much more accessible in his language than West. Again, it's not the tenor of the conversation is not as open tent to me as Bell Hooks is. Yeah. Even the people that she is critiquing, she's inviting you to change. Like
Right.
Have you ever thought about it this way?
Yeah.
I think that her accessibility, it is one of the things that I think are the hallmarks of her writing, and part of why she will be remembered forever as important.
Yeah, I think, also possibly the idea with some of the more controversial, I mean, the biggest controversy that's out there of recent years is her disagreement with, or, kind of back and forth with Laverne Cox.
Intersectionality.
Yeah, right. And just, I think it, maybe one thing to take away from that is and we can talk about it more if we wish, or folks can ask, but one thing to take away from that controversy is that I think that her attitude is that she does not want to close off knowledge and possibility, right? So it's open-ended questions and she'll give you her stance, but she's not going to do what the kind of empiricist model of it's this, let me pin it to the wall, so that when she's disagreeing, even if it's controversial, even if she's saying Beyonce is, a bad example to young Black women, she's not a feminist, she is practicing putting out there being a house slave. These are some of the things she said, which are fairly controversial. It's leading us towards more dialogue instead of closing it off.
Yes. I mean, and the critique is designed to spur on dialogue. All right, better yet, she's taking something people assume to have already know who Beyonce is and this representation of her in this public space. Bell looks at it, RCA dogs it, like, have you ever thought about it this way?
Yeah.
And the open-endedness of it is, I said what I said, drops the mic and walks away. Like, now you have to deal with this new interpretation of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is I think that is a very good way of engagement in discourse, in so much as it provides the opportunity for another perspective without shutting off the possibility for disagreement.
Right. Yeah. Not one of us is a totality.
No.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's this has been fun.
Yes.
So I'll point out just a few things. So
Okay.
when bell hooks came in 2000, that was when CACE had funding for high profile speakers. So I'm just going to remind our audience of that. We have not had such funding in some time. And while we have had extraordinary speakers, we have tended to have local folks exclusively. And I think that, especially as we're entering into this new world with the virtual possibilities, it's important for there to be these lines of communication within our local communities, but out into the national discourses surrounding African-American lives and creative culture and intellectual legacy. So I hope that we'll be able to return to bringing some high-profile scholars as we have in the past. The other thing I'll mention is that Frank Woods was program director when bell hooks came for CACE in 2000. So Frank, who has just retired, just thinking about the fact that it's our faculty who are part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Right. So Michael Coffin as well, who is our longest serving lecturer in AADS, he was part of that conversation as well. Right. So, you know, just understanding the presence, I think, of our program in these conversations and at the profile and moving through culture with bell hooks, as well as creating our own space here at UNC Greensboro.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I didn't know Frank and Michael were there. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing what has happened at UNCG through this program. And bell hooks just being one of many examples. But I'm with you. I really believe that. All right, as an aside, I'm going to go on my bell hooks bag. We're at a moment in UNCG's history where we have the largest African-American population on campus. In fact, it is one of the staples of our campus community. And AADS has been an anchor program for them. Like, that exposes our campus to these national discourses, like bell hooks, Black Lives Matter. These are important parts of contemporary society impinging upon our campus's life and the lives of the people who are on our campus. We should have more discourse, like actual opportunities to hear from people like bell hooks through the agency of this program. I mean, and the schools should take that as an add benefit, like that it invests in. Shameless plug, my bad. I just went on a tangent.
It's not a tangent. It's a very real thing, right? I think you know, we are a collaborative program. We've done a lot with you know, drawing on the labor and resources of others on campus who support AADS related themes and people and students. I think there is a kind of critical growth point that we're at, and it's occurring at a moment where we need more understanding. We need more intellectual contribution. We need more power. So I guess that's what I would say. But to return it to the idea of diversity that Bell Hooks is talking about when she's saying, you know, to remake these terms and conversations and redirect things. You know, one of the mistakes that the university made in the past with kind of anticipating AADS and its needs was to say that it was for Black students. It is for Black students. It is for African-American students on campus. And it is for anyone who wants to learn about this history, culture, peoples, maybe think about their own practices in daily life and live in a community together, right? And, you know, the argument for resources really involves the kind of programming and outreach that African-American and African diaspora studies does. You know, so on the one hand, I guess my message would be that we love to partner with other folks. So that is one way we get our strength, but the other is that there has to be a center. There has to be a core for us to do the work that we need to do.
And to your point about Bell Hooks, well, taking it back to Bell Hooks, the idea of AADS, it is for Black people, but to think that that means that it is cut off to everything else.
Yeah.
It does a disservice not only to what is the realistic understanding of Blackness in terms of a people and population and experience. Like we're made up of everything, but also it's perpetuating the idea that Black lives don't touch anything else outside of their own discursive concerns, which is completely wrong. And the reason we even have this is because Black lives touch everything.
Everything. And that's this conference. That's the
Yes.
whole conference, right? So CACE is a historic conference, or first one organized really in the fall semester of '89 to take place in 1990. That's our first conference. So, and we've had it every year since then. And we're here to support and make central the stories and culture, history, experiences of African-American and African diasporic peoples. So we're going to continue this conversation. In 15 minutes, we have our next panel, which is an African languages roundtable. You're going to find some current students, some former students, Cassandra Workman from anthropology and Dr. Omar Ali in conversation about African languages at UNC Greensboro. So thank you for attending. We hope to see you at this next panel and at the other CACE events. Thank you so much for a good conversation, Armondo.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. Have a good day.
Bye.